hi again to everybody. Please sit down if you can, because we are going to start right now. Thank you. So, thank you. I have the great pleasure right now to introduce Mr. Philippe Lamberts, who is member of the European Parliament, and we will moderate the session with Carola Rackete. So please, Mr. Lamberts, come to the stage. Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone. So we are together in Milano today at the European Ideas Lab. There's a number of people following us on YouTube, and I just want to put everyone on the same page. Why are we here? Because we need to connect the struggles. We need to stand up together because, well, we know that we are up against a planet that is running amok, or destroyed rather by a system that is making it uninhabitable for human beings. We see rising social inequality, rising exclusion, and we know that there's actors of change in society all over the place, trying to resolve these challenges. And we want to engage, we as Greens, we want to engage with those actors of change in society because, well, we humbly believe that we are actors of change in the democratic institutions and at national, local, regional, or even European level. And so it's my pleasure to welcome you, Carola. I see you on the screen, and actually I just discovered that you were born exactly 5 days before my eldest daughter. And I think that the two of you have a lot in common. Well, she's more, how should I say, a militant on the ground, on the earth. You've been there out on the sea. Carola became famous in 2019 because she's a lady with a lot of guts. She sees what's all the ills of this planet, and in this case, how we are treating refugees, asylum seekers, and she wanted to do something about that. Well, she was trained as a navigator, as a ship captain, and well, there she went to the hot place. She went to the hot place between Libya and Italy, and she wanted to do something about that. She rescued asylum seekers, and without being invited, she went to Lampedusa, and this is what got her arrested and famous at the same time. It's a good thing that the judiciary did not find any cause to prosecute her, but I've been impressed by Carola ever since because I didn't know her before. I watched what happened in Lampedusa, but also I've seen what she has been doing and connecting all these challenges that we have, not just refugees, but climate, and there's an obvious link between the two. She's trying to connect the struggles in her daily work. And in that sense, I want to tell you, Carola, well, indeed, I could be your father, but you're a source of inspiration for me. And your energy radiates and gets all of us moving forward, because we know that there's always many reasons to be desperate about the situation, but if we accept to be desperate, then we know that the worst case scenario will happen. It's only when we start believing that actually we can be successful in making this world and our societies better, then things start to change. So Carola, over to you. We are listening.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me this evening. As a first thing that I want to say, because it's very important to me, I would like to express my solidarity with Memo Luciano, the former mayor of Rackete, who was losing his court case today and sentenced to 13 years for aiding and abetting illegal immigration, despite the fact that he has and his community have done tremendous things to advance the rights of migrants and asylum seekers. I truly believe he should never have been prosecuted. And I think we have to stand in solidarity once again, but not only with Memo, as well, and first and foremost, always with the people who are racially discriminated, with refugees and people on the move. So I would really have liked to share this evening with you in Milano, but unfortunately I could not come. In fact, I'm not at home, I'm in the house of some people in Western Germany who are living close to one of the largest open lignite coal pits in whole of Europe. This house I'm sitting in is supposed to be destroyed in the next 5 or 6 years because the coal pit is going to be extended ever and ever more. I'm currently part of an activist occupation on the land of one of the farmers whose house is going to be destroyed next. So I came here actually just this evening to have a little bit better internet and to be sure that I can speak to you. But otherwise, I'm living in the protest camp since already 2 years. This protest camp is growing. It's putting pressure on the newly elected government, which still hasn't built its coalition in Germany. And it's critically important that the new government will hold the extension of the coal pit, that it will move from words to action on the climate crisis, because you all know the crisis is very urgent. So saying that, why I couldn't come to you, I would like to say that I know, of course, that this event is linked to the pre-COP, but for myself, and I'm always speaking from the perspective of an activist and not as a party politician, because I'm not a member of any party, I do sadly not believe that the COP will bring a lot of change, even though it is important. I do think that as activists, it does make a lot more sense to fight projects on the ground where they're happening, to take direct action where it happens, and not to engage too much in performative actions or symbolic protests. So since the coal pit is being extended in Germany, I won't travel, for example, to Glasgow, despite the fact that I'm sure it is important to raise attention there to the issues that are going on. As was said in the beginning, if we want to build collective power for transformative change, then we need to build bridges and alliances, and we need to learn how our vision of the future can align with the vision of other social movements, which include for sure the movements against racism, movements for the rights of migrants, movements in solidarity with exploited workers, movements for the rights of women and trans, initiatives, for example, who demand the end of vaccine patents. All of these need to come together and need to unite. And this is, of course, very important. I'd like to say a few words of caution, particularly to young activists. I would like to say, I think it's important that we understand that we must not appeal to power. We have to challenge power, people who are in power at this moment, and we have to build our own base to challenge that power. I think it's important to understand that being invited to the table doesn't mean that you hold power. What we need is not only to be invited to sit at the table, but for everyone in the world to really truly carry the same importance for their voice. So it's not enough if we say like, we should hear the voices of who are affected. No, they need the same inclusion and the same weight to everyone's voice on the table. So it doesn't really matter how often someone gets invited to speak at a fancy event or at a TV show. It really doesn't matter if you or your movement can't achieve any real political change. And for that, you need to build a really, really strong, solid base of support. And that solid base of support is something that we build always, I think, through personal engagement, through personal conversations, to engaging people in what we are doing, to meeting them where they are, and not first and foremost through social media, through personal connection. And I think it's important as well to understand the difference between organizing and mobilizing. Mobilizing really addresses only the people that are already concerned about an issue. And it means to call out to people to come out at one day to a protest and they will show up. But what we need to do as movements, and what is much more important, is to do that long-lasting work of organizing and including people who are interested in taking actions or who care about an issue but don't know how to get started or what to do. And these are the people that we somehow have to bring together, where we have to build the bridges, that we have to get organized, but also to keep them engaged in the long term. Another thing that I would like to talk about is the question that when we're fighting for climate action or for action on the biodiversity, we have to be sure to understand that the ecological problems that we are facing are very deeply rooted in social injustice and in injustices of power structures. If everyone in the world had the same weight in decision making, we would not be at the point where this level of ecological destruction would even have been possible. So we cannot address the climate crisis as a technological problem or as a natural science problem. It is, in fact, and always has been, a problem of social justice. And if we don't address the issue of justice, then we can't change anything for the better. So at this moment, we see a lot of solutions proposed, which are basically acting or advocating solutions within the same system which has caused the harm. And that's why they basically do not really aim to reduce emissions right now, but they're just trying to find false solutions without actually changing anything. Words that we're hearing quite a lot are things like net zero or offsetting or nature-based solutions. All of these do not really help us to achieve what really needs to be achieved, and that is stopping the harm. Financialization is a huge problem that we're facing at the moment. And it's quite important that we understand that this will not really create a change. So if we attach numbers to so-called ecosystem services and then create tradable financial instruments, it will easily obscure that in effect, nothing is happening at all. So we should not believe these wrong solutions. And I'm very happy to see that there's, in fact, tomorrow on the schedule an event specifically on nature-based solutions and the issues and problems it causes. Another thing which is proposed this year at the COP is a so-called task force for scaling voluntary carbon markets. And Yep Sanyo from the Philippines has said that these talks of an offsetting market worth of $100 billion are a hollow echo in the broken promises made by rich nations to provide actually that same amount of money each year to support climate action across the global south. But buying up our forests, our lands, our nature to greenwash their business as usual is no substitute for climate finance to empower and enable economic transformation. So this is a very clear challenge from someone based in the global south. So, of course, what we need to do is fight for measures that provide clear, immediate reduction in emissions. We cannot allow any sort of offsets, trading, or financialization which will obscure real action. I'm also really happy that this event includes not only climate, but also biodiversity. I think it's a good moment also to tell you why I'm interested in this topic or how it comes that despite the fact that I'm publicly known as a person who's connected to migration struggles, what I'm even doing in this event. 10 years ago, I started working as a navigator and I started working for the German Polar Service for the research vessel. So on my first voyage, we actually went to the North Pole. And I was expecting that everything would be frozen, it would be really hard to get to, and I was expecting that it would take a lot of difficulties to actually get to the North Pole. But in truth, when we got there, it had been very easy, and there was still some ice, but very thin ice, because the ice in that region doesn't get as thick anymore as it used to. So it's not surviving several freezing and melting season anymore. It's mostly only ice that has frozen in the last winter. And on that voyage 10 years ago, I was speaking to some of the scientists, sea ice physicists, meteorologists, oceanographers, and they were saying, look, we have been reporting the lack of and the loss of sea ice for 20 or 30 years already. We have reported everything, but the politicians are not taking action. And I was very lucky to be in that situation, to have the possibility to speak to the scientists at that moment and in the 2.5 years that followed, because I have learned a lot from that, not only about the science, but about the fact that what we're critically lacking is not natural science, but is instead political action. And I decided to quit my job at some time in 2013 and also started to study nature conservation. And I do hold a master's in ecology. And for these reasons, I can connect a little bit to all these different streams of issues, both on the ecological side, but also on the social side. So I'm really, really happy that this event is also talking about biodiversity, which is really often an overlooked struggle, even within people who are interested in environmental issues. And I'm happy and I'm looking forward to hearing more what people have to say in the coming days. In terms of biodiversity, we are also facing the same issues of biodiversity offsets. For example, last year, I was part of an occupation in a forest in Germany for several weeks. We were engaging in direct actions to protect this old growth forest, which was set to be destroyed to build another highway. So the government there was proposing that they were destroying a Natura 2000 site, cutting the old trees, but compensating by young trees. So of course it's completely impossible to compensate for a 250-year-old oak by just planting new trees because they will need another 250 years to get to that stage. We have already now a lack of old forests, and it's the same problem that we are facing actually with biofuels. Of course, the forest can regrow, but it takes a lot of time to do so. And at the moment where we are in the climate crisis, we can simply not cut these old trees and wait for 250 years, nor can the insects wait for another 250 years to get their trees back where they're living in. So often when we have this environmental impact assessments, governments are forced to do offsetting of what is lost, of a forest that is lost maybe in the vicinity. But now there's an idea to make this financialization much more tradable. So we could actually offset in the terms of some credits from one country within the EU to another one. So saying that if we destroy a habitat for bats in one country, you might then protect, let's say, some flamingos in another country. This is absolutely not making sense. It is something that should not even be discussed. In general, the issue of biodiversity is very far from people because it's a bit obscure and technical. But let's just remember that in our daily lives, we're really interdependent on the ecosystems in many ways for our food, also for things like flood protection. We see many floods now in Germany and also in Belgium, and of course for carbon sequestration. We have lost so far about 60 to 70% of the wild animals that were measured in the last 50 years, which is absolutely scandalous and is even beyond imagination. So let's be clear, this is only of the animal species that we could measure. It doesn't include a lot of species where we are data deficient. And it's not the species in themselves, but the numbers of animals. So say we had 100 animals and now we have 30 elephants, for example. The drivers of the biodiversity loss are really clear because in the same way that we have an international panel for climate change, we do have one for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And these experts, thousands of experts which are coming together to make their report, are very clear on what is causing biodiversity loss. So first of all is a lack and a loss of habitat, which is often, for example, if we think of the tropics, the extension of industrial agriculture. It's overuse of resources. So that could be something like overfishing, mainly driven by industrial nations and industrial scale fishing. It's the climate crisis. It's pollution, which is mainly industrial, and it's also invasive species, which are introduced to other ecosystems where they don't belong, mainly by trade. So the drivers of biodiversity loss are very, very clear. And despite that, we have not been able to address them. For example, in the last decade, from 2010 to 2020, the world had set itself 20 targets. And what is very visible maybe to understand how little we hear about biodiversity is that everyone knows about the Paris Agreement, but most people never heard about these so-called Aichi targets. Most people never even heard of them. So last year, when the UN looked at how much had been achieved out of these 20 targets, they found out that none, absolutely zero of these targets had been achieved. And the targets in themselves were good, but the problem was that there were absolutely no concrete measures to actually achieve them, because the protection of biodiversity often runs in contrary to economic interest. And that is also something that, of course, we have seen very, very clearly in the debate about the common agricultural policy in the EU just last year. And I want to raise another important point, which is that same as we are advocating as activists for justice in climate justice, we need to speak about justice in nature conservation. So not only about the fact that conservation needs to be carried out, but critically, how is it being carried out? Because there are quite a few challenges that really need to be addressed. I think first and foremost, we have to be very clear that the conservation movement has a very racist past and still has a neo-colonial present. So that means the idea of a pristine nature, which was empty of people, is absolutely not founded in science, but is a quite Western view. In fact, we know from science that already 12,000 years ago, humans had changed 75% of the landscapes of the whole world, because actually humans and ecosystems are completely interdependent and one couldn't exist without the other. So the idea of a nature park in Africa, for example, devoid of humans, that has only been created by the colonizers. And it's a very Western idea where people have been, particularly indigenous people, but also local people, have just been expropriated, have been kicked out of their land, and a nature park has been created. And that sadly is not a thing of the past, it's something that is still happening today in some places, particularly now when in next April, the Convention on Biological Diversity will come together again. It is discussing a proposal which is called 30 by 30, which means protecting 30% of land and ocean by 2030. And it is crucial and really important that indigenous land rights will be guaranteed in the text of these contracts. Because indigenous peoples, in fact, are the best guardians of biodiversity. If there are no industries on their territories and their land rights are guaranteed, they are protecting biodiversity much better than any of the other cultures, particularly better than the Western culture that we are part of. And it must therefore be possible that people self-manage their areas. So, for example, in management, like an indigenous community conservation area, which is clearly defined. Of course, we already see a lot of words of inclusion in these texts. And we hear about the fact that supposedly free, prior, and informed consent was given. However, there are many cases to this date, also recent cases, where this has not been respected. And it means that we have to hold not only governments, but also big conservation organizations like WWF or Conservation International to account, because they have been involved in human rights abuses and also in carbon offset scams regarding forest protection. So we cannot always trust the big NGOs, nor the smaller NGOs. As activists, we have been critical and we have to hold them to account. So now I'd like to speak a little bit about solutions as well. And I think there's one big core point that I would like to raise. And that is that within that economic system that we have built at this moment, we will not be able to guarantee the long-term survival of human species and these ecosystems. So when I mentioned the panel of biodiversity experts before, they have actually said in their closing report 2019 that we need to find ways, like we need to steer away from the paradigm of economic growth. It's also the UN Environmental Programme and the European Environmental Bureau that are saying that growth cannot be green, because the GDP cannot be decoupled from resource use. So this has quite a lot of reasons, but the main reason is the rebound effect. So the fact that the chainsaw was invented didn't lead to anyone working less, going home after 1 hour of work. No, it actually just meant that a lot more trees were felled, that we used marketing and advertising, and a lot more products were sold. And this is why a technological improvement, which for sure we need in many ways, in itself will never reduce the resource use, but will just lead to more resource use in the end, because we have more technological capacity to actually produce something. The Green Party, sadly, particularly in Germany, is still promoting green growth. And this is also why personally, I just cannot vote for them, because it's being completely unscientific. It's clear we can't green capitalism. There exist, however, many economic alternatives based in ecological economics, which can move us forward. And I'm not going into the details of these alternatives because I would leave that to the economic scientists. The problem really is not the lack of economic alternatives, but the huge structural power imbalances that we are facing to actually make any change. And that is the power imbalance between the people who are affected and the people who are taking the action. So in fact, we need to become actually more democratic on a global level, because let's say the people in Bangladesh whose houses are getting flooded by the rising seas, they can't vote in the election of Germany or in Italy, have any effect on the coal companies or the fossil fuel companies which are headquartered here or which are operating here. On a side note, I do think it is very important that we engage in elections because we have the privilege to vote, or if we have the privilege to vote. I just remind everyone that in Germany now, there was 14% of the adult population who didn't have the possibility to vote because they don't have a German passport for various reasons. So voting is a privilege we should use, and I think we should use it in the sense of becoming more inclusive and giving the right to vote to more people. But what is more important than the voting is actually to engage in social movements and hold the parties to account and to move their programs forward, but also to engage in all sorts of initiatives between those years that we are voting in. I think if we need transformative change, we have to focus on overconsumption. Sorry, I'm a bit distracted because there is a cat here and the cat is climbing on the table. But as said, it's not my cat because I'm visiting someone. So just a few words more before I'm closing my input. So another issue which is often brought forward is overpopulation. But we have to be clear that the poorest half of the people only consume 10% of energy and resources. And we should never blame a child for being born in the society that it's born into. It's important to see that individual and collective action are kind of part of the same coin. So each of us has to change and be part of a transformation. So maybe a child that is born in a society that consumes a lot can later live in a different society, in the sense that the society that we're in is constantly changing and we have to be part of that change. So the most important point is building groups and movements, because most of us are really not stakeholders in a fossil fuel company, but we can altogether use tactics to hold these companies, for example, to account. We can remove their finance, their social license. We can go to court, for example. What is also important here is to see where the roots of the crisis are and fight them at the core. And of course, this I think will be said and has been said already many times today, roots which are social, like racism, colonialism, patriarchy. These are all systems which allow the exploitation of human beings at the benefit of another. So everything that we do need to have justice at the core, and it needs to connect all these different issues. On one hand, we clearly have to stop the harm, and as particularly white or European passport activists, we can also use civil disobedience, we can use direct action, but what we need to do after stopping the harm is also regenerating and finding a vision for a more positive future, for a different future, for seeing the alternatives, for seeing the pluriverse of possibilities that are actually in front of us, if we could make them happen. And that's why I think this event is important. I hope it will have a space for all of you to connect and to talk to each other and to build these bridges which we need, and think about how we can strategically engage in challenging power and making the change that needs to happen. There's one final thing that I want to say to you, and that is that I know a lot of people who are engaged, they are, of course, coming to a point where they are feeling overpowered or also frustrated. And I think we all know this feeling if you're very honest. And it's a question that people often ask. That's why I want to address it. So I think for me, it's inspiring to look to people who are engaging in even far more difficult circumstances than we are here in Europe, who are faced with many, many, many more structural challenges. So for me personally, learning from people who are engaged in these more challenging situations, speaking to friends and activists from Kenya, speaking to self-organized migrants, speaking to people from Sudan, looking at the 6 women who protested today for women's rights in Afghanistan. These are the examples of people who give me courage and inspire me and make me see that despite the challenges that we are facing here, there is so much to learn from other people, and there is so much of inspiration to take for them, which can give us the strength to move forward despite the difficulties that we're having here. So thank you very much for giving me the possibility to speak, and I really hope you will enjoy the event and the possibility to connect.
Thank you, Carola. Thank you very much for your words. I know that in the audience, I assume that a lot of people are willing to ask you several questions. Maybe we can take 5 minutes, if it's okay for you, to reply to 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Great.
Yes, for sure, yeah.
Thanks. So, is there any question? Please, raise your hand. No? Really? Okay.